Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. It's that time again where we go and we tell a whole bunch of different types of true, scary stories. Everything from let's not meet stories to the paranormal and everything in between. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. So, this isn't exactly a scary story, just something paranormal and insane to me. 10 years ago, when I was 14, my dad passed away. I'm 24 now and female. Of course, it was a very traumatic experience for me, as losing a parent would be for anyone, especially being so young. My dad had been transferred to a really nice and huge hospital, where they then figured out that there wasn't anything they could do for him, as he had a massive stroke. They put my dad in hospice, and we literally had to just sit and pretty much wait for him to pass on. They had taken him off life support and unhooked all of his machines, so the family didn't have to sit and watch his heart rate slow until he died. It took my dad hours to pass away. The family didn't really sleep much, but my dad's wife and my eldest sister had decided to sleep on cots in this hospice room. My other sister, aunts, and I had went into the waiting area and laid down. Like I said, we couldn't really sleep, but we tried. As we laid there for what felt like hours, suddenly the lights flipped on, and we all looked to see my eldest sister standing in the door crying. She told us that Dad had passed away. It was as if he waited for us to all lay down with the lights off before passing away. We had all taken turns saying goodbye to my dad before going to sleep also. Anyways, we were all up now, of course. It was around 5 a.m. when my dad had passed away. After sitting in his room crying for a little, the nurses and staff came in to talk with my stepmom about the next steps. Once they finished talking, we all grabbed our things to leave the hospital and drive the 3 hours back to our hometown. We arrived back home, and the first thing I did was go and lay in my dad's bed, in his spot that he always slept. I was crying, and eventually I cried myself to sleep. It felt sort of comforting to sleep in his spot. Anywho, after waking up later that evening, my whole family was at my house now. Everyone was crying and talking about my dad. We were all in the living room. There was a doorway leading into the kitchen that was next to the living room, and you could barely see into the kitchen from where we were all seated. Suddenly, we all heard a loud toy go off. The toys were in an area of the kitchen where my stepmom and dad had set up a small play spot for their grandkids. My stepmom got up and went into the kitchen to turn the toy off. We were thinking that maybe one of our dogs had hit the toy. I went with my stepmom into the kitchen to get a drink. My stepmom walked up to the toy. It was still going off and flashing lights and everything. My stepmom then turned the toy over to flip the switch to off, when she quickly stood back up and looked at me with wide eyes. I asked her what was wrong. She then told me that the toy was already switched to off, and that it wasn't on the entire time that it was going off. We were shocked and couldn't believe it. Then, while we were all standing there, all of the toys started going off. Different sounds and lights all started playing and flashing at the same time, including the toy that she had just showed me was turned off. It didn't spook me though, because I knew then that it was my dad, telling us that he was still with us. A few years later, I had a dream about my dad. The most vivid dream I have ever had, still to this day. I can remember every detail of this dream still, and I've never been able to remember even half of my dreams any other time. I knew that it was my dad coming to talk to me. I won't tell the whole dream, as some of the things said were personal family things. Nothing bad. I was pregnant at the time. Just had found out not long before this dream. I remember seeing my dad looking completely healthy in my dream, as he had had stage 4 lung and brain cancer for years when he passed. It was odd though, as in my dream I saw myself too. It was like one of those movies where two people are on the phone. which we were on the phone in my dream, and the screen is split up in two so you can see both people on the phone. Like I said, I could see myself and my dad talking. He was smiling and looked so happy. I remember crying in my dream, telling my dad I missed him so much and that I was having a baby. He told me that he knew, and that he was so happy that I was having a baby girl. I didn't know what I was having at the time, as I had just found out not long before this. And yes, I did have a baby girl. He told me that he loved me so much and missed me. I remember crying so much and just telling him how sorry I was. At the time of my dad's passing, I hadn't seen him for almost 2 months because I lived with my mom almost 2 hours away from him, and there were family problems going on at my home, so I wasn't able to go see him. I carried around so much guilt for years over that, not being able to see him before he had his stroke, or tell him bye, or I loved him while he was still alive and alert. After telling my dad how sorry I was, he told me to let the guilt go and that it was okay, and he forgave me. He said it had made him sad not to see me for so long, but that he understood and that it was okay, that he loved me so much. I cried so hard in my dream hearing that. When I was starting to wake up, I just remember hearing my dad telling me, "I love you," over and over and over until my eyes opened. I was crying so hard already when I woke up. I had never cried in my sleep before. I got up and ran into the kitchen where my grandma was and just cried so hard to her. After that dream, I felt that a huge weight was lifted off my shoulders. I haven't had a dream about my dad since then, and this was almost 6 years ago. I believe my dad visited me in my dream that night because he knew how guilty I felt and wanted to tell me that he forgave me and that it was okay. Sorry that this is so long. If you read all of this, thank you. Like I said, not scary, but just an experience I won't ever forget. Thank you all. Before starting this story, I would like to say that this story is 100% true, and I am posting this because even years after experiencing this, I wonder if anyone has ever experienced something similar. This story takes place in the year of 2014 in an area near Gainesville, Florida. It was a normal evening, and I had just got off of my Xbox 360 after playing Call of Duty Black Ops with my older brother. Side note, we had the model of the 360 that had the power button that would turn on if you put heat signature close to it. It wasn't an actual button that you would press. Me and my older brother had to clean up the house and turn off all the lights before we were allowed to go to sleep. However, upon returning from doing my nightly chores, I noticed that the Xbox had turned on by itself, which I immediately noticed was very weird because I clearly remembered turning it off. I wasn't too alarmed by this and I simply powered it off again and crawled into the lower bunk of me and my brother's bunk bed. As I was laying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched intensely. It was keeping me up, and it only seemed to intensify the more I tried to ignore it. Then it happened. I heard my Xbox 360 power on, and it instantly threw me off, because all of the remote controllers to the Xbox were on the TV stand, and the only way it would power on is if a heat signature was right in front of the power button. I was startled by this, so I waited a while, but I eventually got up and turned it off again. And as I crawled back into my bed and got comfortable again, I was greeted with chills running down my back as I heard the Xbox power back on. At this point, I was both scared and frustrated. However, this time before I could even react, I was greeted by a bright flash of light in my face, like someone took a picture of me with their flash on. It was sudden and silent, and it was just that, a flash. And before I could react, my room was refilled with darkness. The next thing I heard was my older brother going, "Did you see that?" And I could hear the concern in his voice when he asked the question. As soon as I responded, "Yeah," a second flash happened, except this time the origin of the flash seemed higher up, like it was oriented towards my brother's part of the bed. After this, me and my brother went silent and watched in confusion and unease as the flash reappeared in different parts of the house. But based on how the light would reflect off of the walls, we could tell where it was. It was going in all the rooms of our house, flashing multiple times in every room, and slowly making its way down the hallway. Eventually, it made it into our kitchen. At this point, me and my brother got out of bed and were watching the flashes happen in the living room. Then we watched as the kitchen light turned on and off, except this time, rather than a flash, it seemed as if the light switch was being flipped repeatedly. After about 3 minutes, my brother mustered up the courage and grabbed the pocket knife he had in our room and went into the kitchen to check it out, and the light switch stopped flickering, and the incident was over. This was one of the weirdest incidents I've ever experienced, and would like to know everyone's opinions, or if anyone has experienced or read about something similar. While this is not a typical horror story with ghosts or getting chased by a hooded figure with a knife, this truly was a traumatizing experience. Trigger warning: dead animals. This happened 2 different times on 2 different nights, and although I didn't see it, I definitely heard it. I was laying in bed one night talking to my boyfriend on the phone. It was probably 9:30 or 10 p.m. I heard a scream that sounded like it was coming from upstairs. My bedroom is right below my mother's, but even something that happens outside can sound like it happened inside the house. The scream sounded like it came from my mom. I was horrified, and the feeling that went through my body was pure terror. I imagined that there was a gunman in her room, and that she was screaming bloody murder in fear. I called out for her and didn't get an answer, and then got up from bed and bolted up the stairs. I saw my dad at the window and asked him if my mom was okay, and he said yes. I asked him what the noise was, and he said that it sounded like coyotes. Moments later, we heard their whoops and howls as they ran down our street in celebration. They had just caught their next meal. After I saw the dark outlines of their bodies disappear, I walked into my mom's room and asked if she had heard the commotion. She said yes, and that it sounded like they had gotten a dog. The horrified screaming had not come from my mother, but from a dog at its last moments. The second time this happened was today. It was 3 a.m., and about a half hour has passed since. I was already in a bad state of depression, so I was laying in bed talking to my boyfriend again. I was already crying but was silent. The moment I decided to shuffle my covers to try and get more comfortable, I heard a terrified scream that was most definitely an animal. I couldn't tell if it was my cat just being weird in the basement outside my door, or if it had come from outside. Moments later, I heard a dog barking outside not too far away. I then figured that I had seen something that was a threat, and was scared and barking at it. I again laid in horror at the thought. Only about 3 to 5 barks passed, and then another blood-curdling scream, and then silence. I got a text from my mom telling me to go to bed, and I took the opportunity of her being awake to call in hopes that she had just opened her window to scream at the dog for barking. But then she told me that she thought it was me who made the noise. I burst into tears and went through the worst grieving process of my life. To think that it was someone's dog, screaming in terror, and then barking for its life trying to scare whatever was in front of it away, only to scream moments later as it was murdered. I can only hope that it was able to scare whatever that was away, and that it was able to save itself. I really hope that was the outcome. Sometimes I really wonder if the coyotes from these incidents were actually that, or something more sinister acting as an animal. I hope I never hear something like that again, because even almost an hour later, I can still hear the screams in my head. I really hope I was just seeing things. But back when I was really little, around 4 to 7 years old, the power went off because we couldn't pay the bill. This happened a lot, so I wasn't actually scared, but something just felt off that night. There were also candles that dimly lit the apartment, but none in my room for my dad's fear that I would start playing with it. Anyways, my dad went out to the gas station to buy something and left me home alone, ordered me to go to bed. I didn't, but I left the door open so that I could at least see in my room a little bit from the candles in the kitchen. I usually close my door, but tonight I forgot, so I tried to sleep. But something in my gut just didn't feel right. It might have been from how dark it was, but I swear, and I remember it so clearly, hands coming from the closet all over the side, counting at least 6, and around 10 different face shapes in the closet. I cornered myself while still on my bed and silently waited for my dad to get home. I was terrified, and when he did get home, I ran to him and hugged him. He accidentally stepped on my foot, but I didn't care from how scared I was. I've never shared this story in such detail, and actually adding so much to it brought tears to my eyes from remembering how scared I was. I've told this story probably over 100 times, and despite being the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me, I've come to appreciate that it makes for a great story, so I figure that I'll share it with you all here. I should start by stating that I always hated going camping. My parents sent me to summer camp every year in Colorado, which involved at least one camping trip into the woods. Despite the brevity of these trips, I always resented them. The heavy bag, the lack of toilets, the spiders that always found their way into my tent. When I turned 16 and became a camp counselor in training, however, my distaste for the whole experience briefly changed. At that age, we were only a few years older than the oldest campers, but we were given considerable leeway in what we were allowed to do. Most nights, we would have to stay in the cabin with our campers, but it was rumored that the camping trip was a time where the counselors in training would get drunk, smoke weed, and hook up with each other after everyone else went to sleep. What I didn't know, however, was that the events of that camping trip would dissuade me from ever going camping in the woods again. The trip began as any other. Altogether, there were around 30 people on the trip, 4 counselors in training, 4 counselors, and around 20 or so boys and girls between the ages of 13 and 14, walking in a single file line up and down the various trails. You could hardly hear any sounds of nature over the conversation and laughter of the campers. Several hours went by and we made our way through a dense marshy area and up a steep incline populated with evergreens and aspens. I wasn't the most athletic kid, so it was around this point that I found myself at the back of the line with the other of the counselors in training, Jordan, as well as 2 other campers who were also struggling to keep up. The 4 of us started chatting, and in our distracted state, we began to fall more and more behind the rest of the campers, until the last of them faded out of view around a bend about 50 feet up the way. Unconcerned, we kept walking at the same slow pace, but after 30 minutes or so, the trail started to level off, and I began to feel increasingly anxious. Not only had the rest of the group disappeared ahead of us, but we had entered a stretch of completely dead evergreens, half of which looked torched by a wildfire, and the other half appeared to have been killed by disease. The eeriness of the landscape was punctuated by a small derelict cabin sitting in the middle of the scorched forest, but seemingly untouched by the fire that must have spread through the area. We were so enraptured by the scene that one of the campers screamed when a twig broke behind us. Jordan and I started laughing a bit, but we quickly stopped when we turned to look at where the sound had come from. Not 20 feet behind us was a haggard-looking man with a messy nest of black hair and a long black beard, slowly making his way up the trail with his eyes locked on us. He didn't appear to have any hiking supplies on him, and we have no idea how long he had been walking behind us. Being young, we were naturally pretty freaked out, but Jordan managed to give the guy a slight wave before saying to the rest of us, "Come on, let's speed up and get back with the rest of the group." As we turned to continue our way up the path, the man mumbled a question that was hard to hear, and I was shocked when Jordan turned around to ask the man to repeat himself. The man muttered again, slightly louder. "Going camping?" Jordan answered the man that yes, we are going camping, to which the man smiled slightly before stating in a creepy and ominous voice, "Better be careful." We nodded and gave him a half-hearted thank you before continuing on to try to find the rest of the group, this time with a much faster pace. Although the man had been walking up the same trail as us when we saw him, he didn't continue, but instead just stood there in the middle of the trail, watching us as we made our way up the winding path and disappeared from his view. Finally, we managed to catch up to the rest of the group, who had been waiting for us, and we told the adult counselors about our interaction with the man. They just shrugged it off, telling us that the guy probably lived in that cabin and just wanted to know what we were doing near his property. Still, I felt unnerved by the encounter, and when we finally arrived at the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had somehow followed us. Eventually, though, I put it out of my head and managed to enjoy myself a bit. Everyone else had gone to bed, and Jordan and the other counselor in training from the boys' cabin had brought 2 warm Mike's Harders that they had stolen from the counselors' quarters, and I took out a joint that I had stashed away for this exact occasion. To avoid getting in trouble, we decided to hike out into the woods a bit to smoke the joint, and we made our way to the edge of the river where we had washed our pots and pans earlier in the day. The spot was very silent, and the thought of the man from earlier kept popping into my head. Assuming that I was cold, not anxious, Jordan gave me his blue hoodie, and this prompted one of the other girls to suggest that we switch tents for the night so I could sleep in the same tent with him, and she could sleep in the same tent as the other boy. I had absolutely no problem with this, and after smoking the joint, we made our way back to the tents, which were pitched slightly away from the others, and we discreetly sipped on the Mike's Harders while telling scary camping stories. Some time passed, and one of the boys was in the middle of telling a rather muddled story that he was clearly making up on the spot, when he suddenly stopped. In the silence, we could hear what sounded like footsteps crunching on pine needles about 40 feet away, near one of the other campers' tents. As we strained to listen to what was going on, the noises stopped, and even though we assumed it was just one of the campers getting up to go to the bathroom, being stoned and hopped up from the scary stories, we decided to call it a night and go hide in our tents. Jordan followed suit, and we awkwardly made out before eventually going to sleep. I don't know what time it was, but it must have been quite late when I suddenly woke to the distinct sounds of footsteps walking around near my tent. Shot with adrenaline, I tried to lay as still as possible and quiet my breathing. From the sound, it was apparent that someone was less than 3 feet away from the front of my tent, seemingly pacing back and forth. I turned to wake up Jordan, but I was immediately put at ease when I saw that he wasn't next to me. Assuming Jordan was the one I had been hearing, I closed my eyes and I was just beginning to drift back to sleep when I heard the tent unzip. I felt Jordan lie down next to me, and after a few moments he put his arms around me and began to spoon me. After nearly drifting off to sleep again, I realized I had to go to the bathroom and muttered something about having to go pee before beginning to unzip my sleeping bag. Seemingly annoyed by the noise, Jordan lazily turned over, pulling his hoodie up over his head, before going still again. Quietly, so as not to wake him, I unzipped the tent and quickly scanned the campsite for any movement. Comforting myself that Jordan had just gone to pee and was fine, I put my shoes on and began making the trek across our campsite to the designated pee zone. I had just made it to the area and pulled my pants down when I heard rustling coming from the campsite, as if someone was rummaging through our supplies and bags. Still slightly drunk, I tried to pull my pants up, and in my haste, I lost my balance and tried to catch myself with a branch that made a loud snapping noise when I grabbed it. I tried to gather myself as quietly as I could, but when I finally managed to look up, I could see that there was a figure making its way across our campsite in my direction. Before I could even think, I was blinded by the bright light of a flashlight shining directly into my eyes, and the light was getting bigger. So, whoever it was, they were coming towards me. Frozen in panic, the figure got 10 feet away from me before I heard Jordan's voice say, "Sorry, it's just me." I breathed a sigh of relief, but then Jordan asked me something that really confused me. Have you seen my blue hoodie? I know you gave it back to me, but I think one of the campers might have stolen it from my bag while I was sleeping." After a brief pause, I managed to stutter out, "But you were just wearing it when you got back to the tent." What he said next made my blood run cold. "What are you talking about?" he said. "It's been missing since we got back from the river. I even went down there to see if I had left it by accident, but after I couldn't find it, I thought I'd check the boys' bags, and that's when I saw you." My confusion quickly turned to sheer terror as I realized that the man who was into the tent with me just moments prior hadn't been Jordan. Sensing that something was wrong, Jordan asked me what had happened, and I managed to get out that whoever stole his hoodie was sleeping in our tent. Not believing me, Jordan insisted on walking back to the tent to check it out. As slowly and quietly as possible, we made our way to the side of the tent, and when Jordan flipped on his flashlight and shined it through the nylon lining, he let out a high-pitched scream. We could both see the clear outline of a man's shadow lying still inside our tent. What happened next is a bit of a blur, but we ran to the pond of tents on the other side of the campground where the older counselors were sleeping and frantically unzipped their tent and started yelling for them to come out and that there was a man in our tent. I remember panic setting in as our counselors slowly and groggily woke up. But after a bit more of frantic yelling, they finally managed to understand the severity of the situation when a commotion broke out on the other side of camp near our tent. By the time they ran to the scene, however, they only found an unzipped tent and a bunch of our things littered on the ground that the man had apparently knocked over or thrown during his escape. After that, we heard the counselors radioing back down to the camp to call the police, and we could tell that they were as scared as we are. I don't think any of us slept after that. Luckily, we only had to wait a few hours for the sun to come up, and by that time, a few of the other counselors had arrived with guns to escort us back to camp. On our way back down, one of the campers found Jordan's jacket tied around one of the trees on the path like some kind of marker. Needless to say, he didn't want the hoodie back, and we just left it there. To this day, I can't say for certain that the man in the tent was the same guy that we ran into earlier on the trail, but his face and that night still haunt me. I moved in with my aunt and grandmother recently. They live in an older home, so I'm used to hearing creaks or odd noises from time to time, but this has been freaking me out for a while now. Every morning I wake up between 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. to a rapid pounding noise. It's literally like someone is trying to break down my door. I asked my grandmother if she could hear it from her room, thinking it may be the water pipes releasing air pressure, but she said no. So that made me freak out more. One night I decided to stay up and wait, and right on cue, at 4 a.m., I heard a soft scratching noise, and then the loud pounding again. My doorknob even started to rattle. It sounds stupid, but I hid under my covers until the noise stopped, and after about 30 minutes or so, I think it did. I just remember everything was quiet. I don't know why this is happening to me. I've asked everyone in my family, and they usually try to brush it off, but I know something is there. I know I'm not crazy because my sister had a similar experience when she was around my age. If anyone has any advice on what I can do, then please let me know. I just want this to stop. I can barely sleep at night anymore. I got a temporary job with Google, driving one of those vehicles with a mounted 360 camera system. It was a fun job. I was tasked with recording highways, streets, and sometimes off-beaten paths in the middle of nowhere. I was assigned a company vehicle, and I worked as a one-man unit. They paid for gas, hotel, and I got a per diem for food. Pay was about $7,000 per month before taxes. 1099 employee with no benefits though. My car was my office, and I would work 5 10-hour days weekly. I wouldn't have any human interactions for days, and it was a lonely job. But I enjoyed all the sightseeing adventures. The job was easy, but it required a lot of multitasking. You had a computer inside of your car, had to navigate the road, and manipulated the camera system mounted on the roof. The job brought me to a small town somewhere north of Maryville, California. It was a quiet town and had a nice countryside vibe to it. I was finishing up my shift before my weekend, and I decided to take a shortcut by driving down the dirt road, which I thought connected to the highway. I really regretted doing that. It was 5 p.m. in the evening in the middle of July, so the sun was still out. Due to the heavy foliage and overgrown trees, the path I drove was really dark and creepy. The forest made for a scene out of a horror movie. I put my headlights on just so I had better vision. As I was making a sharp turn on this downhill slope, I observed my headlights reflecting on a yellow dead-end sign. Luckily, there was plenty of room for me to do a U-turn safely. This part of the dirt road was the darkest part of the forest, with only small patches of sunlight penetrating through the canopy from the overgrown trees above. Once my car repositioned to exit the area, I looked in my rearview mirror and I noticed someone standing behind the dead-end sign. It looked like a kid, maybe 13 years old. He had one of those bowl-cut haircuts and wore dark, collared, raggedy clothing. His face was pale, and he had that 1,000-yard stare. I could feel his gaze locked towards my direction. He had no facial expression, did not blink, and stood frozen in place. I felt I should check on his welfare and asked if he was okay. I rolled down my window and reversed my car, closer to where the kid was standing. Once I saw the brake lights reflect off the yellow dead-end sign, I parked my car. I was expecting for him to come to my driver's side window, but the kid never came. I looked into my rearview mirror and he was gone. I didn't even hear any footsteps or the sounds of any twigs snapping. If the kid left, he must have been a trained ninja. The forest was eerily silent. The only sound that stood out was the engine from my car. I drove away slowly and egressed up the hill. As I came within 100 yards eyesight of the main road, I saw the same looking kid walking about 50 yards in front of me. It's possible it could have been someone else, but the dark-colored shirt, raggedy jeans, and physical stature resembled the kid from earlier. His back was exposed to me. I couldn't make out his hairstyle or skin complexion from that distance. He walked away from the forest onto the main road and walked eastbound. I waited until he was out of sight before I exited the forest and drove the opposite direction. I was so frightened, I didn't even bother to check out the rearview mirror. I redlined the hell out of there and booked it for dear life. Our cameras worked via LiDAR system and automatically recorded 360 panoramic photographs while the car was in motion. At the time of the encounter, my camera was recording. Therefore, I suspected the kid was likely captured in one of the images. I reviewed the photos from where I made my U-turn at the dead-end sign. Nothing. No kid. No shadow. Not even a silhouette of a person of any form. The only photo captured was the yellow dead-end sign, the overgrown trees in the background, and dust particles from me driving on the dirt road. I reviewed the same recording from the second sighting of the kid upon our exit. Nothing. I had zero evidence of any person or persons being captured in any of my recordings. I don't know if it was due to the lack of sleep, being dehydrated, or my eyes playing tricks with me, but I'm pretty sure that I saw a ghost. So I work at a hotel. During work, a guest came to me at the front desk and said there was a man sleeping on a desk in the hallway. The desk was kind of like a public computer spot, and the guest said that he didn't look well. So me and my coworker went to ask him some questions. We asked things like, "What's your name? Are you okay?" etc. But when we asked him where he's from, he had to think about it for a minute before he said New York. This was false. He was from Texas. He was clearly having a hard time speaking and moving. Like, I asked him to pull out his wallet so I could check if he had any medical cards on him, like a DNR or a card listing his medical conditions. I didn't find any though. But just taking out his wallet out of his pocket took at least 2 minutes. Then I asked him if he had any medical conditions, and he said diabetes. I asked him if he had insulin. I have diabetics in my family. I know how to treat this. And he said no. Now, a diabetic without insulin is a death sentence. And he was acting exactly like my uncle and great aunt does when their blood sugar drops. So I called 911. They asked him if he was a diabetic, and he said yes, although he was very combative the whole time. Turns out his blood sugar was normal. They gave him a breathalyzer test, and he blew .43. That is potentially lethal. The police officer said he could have died if I didn't call 911. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, and I had decided to stay behind to catch up on some work. At first, I was happy to have the house to myself, but as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. I tried to distract myself with work, but every creak and groan of the old house made me jump. I tried turning on some music, but even that couldn't drown out the sense of unease that was growing inside of me. As I was about to head to bed, I heard a strange noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps, but I knew that I was the only one in the house. I tried to shake off the feeling of fear that was creeping up on me, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But then I heard the footsteps again, louder this time, and I knew that something was wrong. I crept up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top, I saw a figure moving in the shadows. It was tall and thin, with long fingers that seemed to stretch out towards me. I froze, not sure what to do, but then the figure turned towards me and I saw its face. Or rather, I saw the lack of a face. It was just a blank, featureless void. I screamed and ran back down the stairs, but as I reached the bottom, I heard the figure following me. It was moving faster now, its footsteps echoing through the empty house. I knew I had to get out of there, but my keys were upstairs. I was trapped. As the figure drew closer, I saw that it was holding something in its hand. It was a knife, glinting in the dim light. I thought that it was the end for me, that I was about to be killed by some unknown intruder. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. I stood there, shaking with fear and confusion. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that I never wanted to be alone in that house again. Growing up, I always felt uneasy living on the highway. It was out in the middle of nowhere. My grandparents owned the only store that was close, which, surprisingly, being next to the highway and being the only store for miles, didn't get a lot of customers. Honestly, I didn't think much of the strange occurrences. The lights coming on, scratches on the roof of my room, noises coming from the woods, and most of all, the deaths. A man had passed away in my grandparents' room a few years before we moved on, but nothing ever came of it. A few years ago, my grandma started seeing orbs or shadows. She said there was a light-colored one and a pure black one, and they never brought any harm. But the black one would always seem to try and get to my grandma, but the white one would stop it just before it could reach her. Around this same time, I started to dabble in spirituality. Tarot cards, black salt, Greek mythology, etc. I believed and still believe in ghosts, demons, angels, even skinwalkers or skinnies as I call them. I can recall a few instances where I truly cannot forget. The time a skinwalker was in the woods, waiting for me and my grandma to come even a step closer. Strange occurrences when I was alone in the house. The uneasy feeling that something was always watching me. Hell, even the nightmares and times that I woke up in the middle of the night. The top 3 that terrify me the most are the stories that I'll be sharing here. Instance 1. This was back in 2021. My neighbor had given me her 3 cats that she couldn't care for anymore. Well, the 2 bobcats were outside cats, while the other was an inside cat. The inside cat got pregnant/was pregnant when we got her. She cared for the babies, but one day she had went outside. She never came back. She always came back. We went looking for her near the wood lining, but I didn't see her. I had seen the back half of a cat, however. And right after that, the flashlights me and my grandma had showed a little bit of a shadow. And when I say that thing was huge, I don't know what it is to this day, but I don't know if it wasn't a wild animal. Instance 2. I had watched a movie that was claimed to be haunted. I can't recall the name of it, but it was a weird movie. Well, while watching it, I was alone, and surprise, surprise, it was storming outside. Well, halfway through the movie, all the power went out, and I heard a sharp screaming type sound blast through my headphones. I almost cried, and I'm not gonna lie. I don't know if it was something to do with the movie I watched or what. The last instance, the nightmares. I had just gotten comfortable sleeping in my own room due to past trauma. Well, it was all good at first until the nightmares started. It was excruciating. I could feel the pain with each gunshot, cut, or cat accident. My dreams were so vivid to the point that I forced myself to pull an ungodly amount of all-nighters. Not to mention the times I would wake up to my speaker being on, or inclines in volume from the TV. I'm not saying these instances are related to the abnormalities of life or ghosts, but please, whatever you do, don't move onto Highway 441. Back when I was working at McDonald's, about 2 months ago, I would walk to either the local Subway or the Dairy Queen. The Subway was probably a good mile there and back. This was the first time I had ever walked like that in town. I only went to get lunch. I had my AirPods in and heard someone yelling. I thought maybe someone was injured, so I turned around and found a large man with a beard in a pickup truck. He seemed nice enough, said he was going to the Pizza Hut down the road from the Subway and he would drop me off. I said okay, because I didn't want to be rude after telling him no thanks a time or two. He drove me down the road, and we talked for what felt like an hour, which in reality was only a minute. He was telling me how he's a good guy, and how he doesn't do stuff like that, and even stated that he liked women, but not enough to kidnap or do anything bad to them. I said I liked women too, and he said he could hook me up with his friend. I politely declined, and he pushed on and started showing me naked photos of one of his friends. He said he could hook me up with her, and he wouldn't be part of it. I started getting uncomfortable and told him I was only 17, but he still pushed and asked if I was legal, so I preferenced again that I was only 17. We made it to Subway and I got out, and he offered to give me money. I declined and he offered to wait on me. I declined that too. After I almost made it to the door, he called me over and said he could take me out. He said he'd pay me and he only wanted to hold hands. I said no thanks, and my grandma would be there shortly to get me, which I think scared him because I headed in and he was gone. I quickly made my way back to the McDonald's and almost cried from how scared I was. I was sad, angry, and even happy. The only thing I could think was to laugh it off. I don't think I'm going to walk around getting in people's cars, even if they have nice intent, ever again. When I was younger, I can always remember my dad telling me that my grandfather, his dad, had a terrifying experience when he was younger, but my dad couldn't remember the story properly to tell me. So I said that I would ask him. My dad said never to ask him as it still shakes him up. Well, one night me and my grandfather were telling ghost stories. and he had had a few beers that night, and he started to tell me the story. He started by saying he has only ever told a handful of people, and he will only tell it to someone once. When my grandfather was young, around 10 to 12, he lived in a small village outside of town where he went to school. He would get home every Friday night and go and help an elderly woman who lived in the village, look after her garden, and do small jobs around her house. She didn't have any family or children, so my grandfather and his parents looked after her. So he gets off the bus, heads to the old lady's house. He unlocks the shed and gets the old push lawnmower out and begins to do the grass. He looks into the living room window and sees the old lady, who smiles and waved. After my grandfather had finished cutting the grass, he puts everything away and knocks on the door to collect his pay. The old lady slides the money and a hard sweet out of the mail flap onto the door and says, "Sorry, I'm not feeling too well, but here is your money." So my grandfather says thank you very much, and she replies, "You're welcome, good lad." My grandfather returns home, and his mother and father are sitting in the kitchen. They tell him to take a seat, and they tell him, "We have something to tell you, but you probably already know. The old lady we look after died this morning. That's why she isn't at home, and you won't have been paid." My grandfather replies, telling them that they're wrong, because he has just spoken to her and seen her through the window. They obviously don't believe him until he pulls up the money and the hard sweet from his pocket. They all freak out and go to the house, where they find all the doors and windows locked and no one inside. As they're walking away, my grandfather turns around, and there she is, standing in the doorway waving. Nobody believed him, and he was so scared and confused. This sent chills down my spine when he told me, and he said no one believed him, and he shouted, "I know I spoke to her, and I definitely seen her." And to this day, he still won't look at that house she lived in, just in case she is standing there, waving. I don't know what to title this, since this story is a little bit all over the place and is making me question my sanity. I have bad storytelling and I have no clue how Reddit works, but I downloaded it so I could get this weird, scariest dream out there. This story happened last night. I was staying up late scrolling on my For You page, and around 1 a.m. I decided it was time to go to sleep. The whole night went like this. Regular dream. Asteroid hits something near me, and when the asteroid goes up in the air and floats there for a good few seconds, revealing some weird symbol on it. Wake up, go back to sleep, repeat. I think I was on the 4th or 5th dream when I realized the strange pattern, while halfway through my current dream. I started to get weirded out by that, and decided to try and wake up. It wasn't working. It felt like something was keeping my eyes closed. At last, I was able to open my eyes, or so I thought. It was part of the dream. At this point, I started to freak out, desperately trying to open my eyes. Every time I thought I finally opened my eyes, it was just my mind playing with me. Normally, I would just shrug this experience off and keep it to myself, but it was when a voice in my head said something along the lines of, "I am the controller of your mind," and some other stuff, but it's all blurry. As soon as the voice finished speaking, I was able to open my eyes. I've been thinking about this since this morning, and I'm starting to freak out. Mind you, I've also had past dreams about the weird asteroid when I was younger, which makes it even weirder. I don't know if this is just my mind playing with me, or if some weird entity is trying to communicate. I know some people won't believe me, and think that I'm saying this for attention. I swear on everything that this happened to me. In the 80s, I was living in an apartment. One night, I was watching television. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man standing in the corner of my living room. He was wearing a hat and suit. He wasn't looking directly at me, but straight ahead. I turned to look and there was nothing there. Years later, I did some web searches looking for info on my old apartment building to see if anyone else experienced weird things there. There was a post on a ghost story website. The poster named the apartment building that I lived in. His apartment was right next to mine, at the top of the stairs in our building. In his post, he said that when he lived there during the 90s, and was 4 or 5, he would tell his dad about the man who lived in the picture on the wall. He would come out and talk to him. He said when he was older, while he was watching television with his dad and his dad's girlfriend, playing cards that had been sitting on top of the TV fell off onto the floor, where they could then see impressions on the carpet as if someone were being dragged across the carpet right in front of them. This part is pure conjecture. I remember the old lady who had lived next to me in that apartment. I imagined that she had died in the apartment in the living room, and when they moved her body to take her to the morgue, the boy was seeing residue of what had happened, heels dragging along the carpet. I remembered when I was her neighbor. She had pictures all over her fireplace mantle. They were of her husband who had passed away. I imagined that it may have been him who was standing in the corner of my apartment, and him who was the man in the picture on the wall that the little boy had talked to. So I was at a camp, and I was wandering around because I was bored. I had nothing to do when I thought about going up the hill. It's a 5-minute walk up and had a beautiful view of the whole camp. It was dark out and I saw something weird on the hill, so I walked over to get a better look, and the thing looked like it was waving at me and moving, and it was making a weird sound like a rattlesnake's tail mixed with hissing. I thought it was the wind, but there wasn't even a breeze, and the sound got louder, and it stopped waving to me. The arm went down and it started to move, so I pulled out my phone as fast as I could and ran to it, when all of a sudden it was gone. I thought, what the heck is that? I was spooked, wondering as I heard a loud sound behind me, and turned off my light, and something ran past me. Then, thankfully, my friends came up, and I ran to them telling them what had happened. Them looking at me weird. But we went up and tried to look for it, but we couldn't find it. But what I saw that day will scare me the rest of my life. Exploring abandoned houses has always been a hobby that I share with my best friend Justin. Oregon is known for their abandoned towns, and in 2018 we stumbled upon one. It was filled with crumbling houses, churches, and various outbuildings. After looking in lots of windows and stepping inside some of the safer-looking structures, we decided to check out the biggest and creepiest of them all. Walking inside this place immediately unsettled us both. It was like walking into a scene from an apocalypse movie. Several bunk beds, ripped mattresses, couches, soiled and forgotten toys, deteriorating children's books, and more were all strewn about this one large, disgusting room. An entire wall of small cribs were bolted in rows. Justin and I both thought this sad, forgotten orphanage was similar to an animal pound. It was clear we weren't the first visitors since the original residents up and left. There was graffiti, broken bottles, and an old destroyed microwave. Thoroughly creeped out, we decided to head back to the car. We weren't even 5 feet out of the door when a piercing noise came right from behind us, right in the middle of the orphanage room we had just left. I can only describe the noise as hundreds of rats screaming in torturous pain. It was coming from that stupid microwave, and it was loud. My friend Justin is definitely the type who would die in a horror movie, because he immediately went back to investigate. The ancient appliance was smashed open, bent, and almost undecipherable, including the power cord, which had been cut and ripped out. There was no reason, no sense or explanation in this blood-curdling noise coming from the microwave. Covering my ears and filled with a sense of intense fear, I begged him to get the F out of there. We hightailed it out of there, both white as a sheet and shaking. It was only when we had put a few miles in between us and that dreadful place did we start laughing. Who the hell can say they've been haunted by a microwave? I laugh about it even still, but the pure terror and sense of dread that I felt that day will always stick to me. Something was not right in that place. I've been meaning to write down my paranormal experiences as a child growing up. Get ready because this is a long one. These are experiences from different members of my family and over several years. So a little backstory first. I grew up in a sleepy little village. It's also known as the Garden of England, named as such for its picturesque gardens. Nothing much ever happened there. But little does anyone know of the village's dark past. A truly dangerous place in the 1600s where smuggling, murders, and crime was rife. Things were so bad that the name of the village was changed, and eventually the old reputation along with it. If you saw it now, you'd struggle to believe it could have ever had such a dark past. In the center of the village is a small cottage. Across from it, a quaint English pub, and next to that, a church. The old cottage, as you've probably guessed, is where I grew up. Now, below the cottage was a large basement we called the den. It was used by the whole row of houses during the wars as an air raid shelter, as it was below ground, large, and secure. Growing up in the house, I remember my parents telling me it was originally used for smuggling. They told me that there were old blocked-up tunnels that ran from the pub and to the church that connected to our house. So this house was already at the center of some turbulent history. I had already gone through some pretty weird and haunting happenings living there. Well, before I'd learned of any of this, though. From as early as I can remember, I'd had night terrors nearly every night in my little box room, right down the narrow hall. These nightmares were graphic, nothing a small child would make up, and it was the 90s, so parents found it easy to monitor what me and my sisters were watching on TV, reading, etc. We were never allowed to watch scary films. I was only allowed to read Goosebumps when I was about 12 or 13. At ages 4 and 5, these nightmares were horrific. Half bodies dragging themselves up the stairs and the hallway up to my room. People stealing me from my bed and shadows creeping from underneath my bed. I also had a gollywog my parents put at the end of my bed. Apologies and no offense intended, I hated it. It was a gift from someone I can't remember. That would also visit my dreams, crawling up my bed while I was sleeping and suffocating me. Of course, it would have moved when I woke up, but my parents would put this down to me kicking it in my sleep, which honestly is plausible. Despite this, my parents insisted I was being silly and would place it at the end of my bed. As soon as I hit teenage years, I got rid of it. Although, thinking back now, I can't remember how I got rid of it. These were only a few of the horrific nightmares, but it was every night, and I would wake up screaming bloody murder. Looking back, I'm not sure how my parents coped. There was also the hallway leading up to the stairs and then the landing. Anytime I had to turn out the light to go upstairs, I would run, almost hit my back to the wall. It always felt as if something was there, right behind you, grasping for an ankle to pull you back down with it. Pretty normal, right? Who hasn't had nightmares or run to their bed a little quicker after turning out the light when they were a kid? The thing is that my parents, or more my mom, would do it too. I remember my mom telling me when I was older, as more of the cowardly thing she ever did was when my little sister, who was now in my old box room, had a nightmare. She got into the bed with her, comforting her till she fell asleep. She told me that she had to get up and go back to her own room. She couldn't stand to be in there any longer. She was that terrified. Not that my parents' room was much better. It was right at the top of the stairs and my new, larger room next to theirs. From both rooms, you could often hear footsteps at night, coming up the stairs and along the hallway. I remember my mother telling me one night that the footsteps came thundering up the stairs, right up to her side of the bed. She shuffled over my dad's side when he turned around and asked, "Did you hear that?" Now, my dad is a skeptic. He doesn't believe in anything paranormal. But that night, well, he can't explain it to this day. My older sister's room was in the den for a bit, and then I shared rooms with her for a little while. My room was being painted. You'd think down there, in the dark basement, it would have been the scariest place to be. Even my older sister used to tease that we slept on the same level as the people across the road, i.e. the people buried in the cemetery behind the church. But weirdly enough, it was the rest of the house that turned out to have the most activity. I remember one night my little sister was sleeping in my parents' room when suddenly she woke up screaming in terror. It was so blood-curdling that all of us ran up the stairs to see if she was okay. We were all scared that she was hurt. We got to the room. She was stood up in bed, still screaming, pointing at the window. Once she'd calmed down, she told us that there had been someone standing at the window. This was one story up. No one could have been standing in the window. But even to this day, she is adamant that there was someone there. My mom also told me one night she woke up to see a figure of a girl in the doorway. Thinking it was one of us, she asked, "Are you okay, darling?" It moved behind the door. Puzzled, she got out of bed and moved the door away from the wall. There was no one there. Eventually, my older sister got a job as a flight attendant, and my parents thought it would be better to swap rooms with her so she could leave at all hours easily to catch flights, etc. Looking back, I'm not sure if it was so they didn't have to be in that room any longer. When my sister was away on flights, I'd hear talking and drawers opening and closing from that room. I'd just pull the covers over my head and say to myself that I was just hearing things. One night, though, when my older sister was at home, she came bursting into my room in hysterics. She told me that she woke up to a girl crying at the side of her bed. Thinking it was our younger sister, she went to comfort her. She suddenly realized it wasn't her. She pulled back quickly. That's when she was grabbed by her ankle and dragged right to the bottom of the bed. Terrified, that's when she ran straight into my room. That night, we slept in the same bed with the lights on. A long time after that, I remember one day, during the day, looking up from my seat in the front room to see a girl with dark braided hair running through our hallway and up the stairs. I asked my father who it was, and he looked at me confused and told me there was no one there. I went upstairs to where she ran to, and sure enough, there was no girl there. Once, me, my sister, and my mom happened to be talking about our individual experiences. My mom's with the girl standing in the doorway, my sister with the girl next to the bed, and me with the girl running up the stairs, and we realized it was all the same girl that we had been seeing. White dress and dark braided hair. At that moment, a candle from the mantelpiece flew across the room. Luckily, it wasn't lit. We were all shocked. There was no way it just fell that way. It was like someone had swiped it off the mantel. For me at least, the girl was one presence in the house, but I believe there was another, darker presence there. For example, the front room doorway at certain times of the day, there would be a smell of men's body odor. My dad was always meticulously clean, and it would even happen when he wasn't in the house. There were different occasions where different people could smell it at different times with no explanation. Often the dog would also bark at nothing, and doors would open and close by themselves. I would very often and very regularly hear my dad's voice call me when he was at work or not in the house. I would just brush this off as hearing things. However, it was only after moving to a new house years afterwards and looking back that I realized it wasn't normal. As I grew up and lived in different places, I realized that it proved the cottage was definitely haunted, as we never had experiences like that again. Any other paranormal experiences I've had in my life have never been so negative or imposing. My mom always tried to comfort us by saying people may have died in that house, but many would have been born there too. But I truly believe something terrible happened in that cottage. Anyway, sorry it's so long. We lived there for 10 years, so I tried to shorten it down as much as I could. Thanks for reading. I experienced this last year around February or March. I'm from the Philippines, and as you may have heard, we have a lot of beliefs here. I didn't really believe in paranormal events until this happened. So I live in a house with my aunt and cousins along with my sibling. There are a total of 5 people in the house at that time. Helping and fixing the table was my thing, while my tita did the dishes and fed the dogs. The older brother was asleep at the time, while my 2 other cousins were playing in the living room. After I fixed the table, I went to my room and took my towel. It felt like someone was watching me, but I didn't pay too much attention. I took a shower and I heard a screeching sound outside and thought it was the dog, and then I heard my tita's voice. I went to my room to change my clothes when I felt that feeling again, the feeling of someone watching me. I heard my tita's voice again calling my name. This time, I looked out the window. I saw a face. I thought it was my aunt playing tricks with me, so I called her out. But then my aunt spoke to me that she was in the living room. My whole body felt cold. I looked at the window again. It was still there, staring right at me with those wide eyes. I wasn't able to move or do anything. I was standing there, and it felt like my feet were glued to the floor. I wasn't able to run or even let out a scream. Her face was rotting and her eyes almost poking out. I fought myself and ran as fast as I could, grabbing a towel to cover my naked body. I went outside my room and hugged my aunt. I cried so bad. My whole body was shaking. I told her about what happened, and after that she let me sleep in her room with my cousins. It's been a year now, but it still terrifies me. We moved to a new house with my mom and my older brother. I don't feel anything here, not even someone watching me from the window. One of my first jobs I had was an after-hours janitor at Walmart. I worked from 9:30 p.m. to 6 a.m. when the manager got there. Now, I was typically with 2 others, but it varied, and a few nights I was alone. One of the only things I found creepy was the warehouse downstairs. It was the same size as the actual Walmart. We had to go down there to grab the soap to run the machine we used to wash the floors. We rarely needed to, as there were a few left out for us. One night I was there alone. I had used all the floor cleaner and had to go down to the warehouse to get some soap. It already had an eerie vibe to it. Pretty dimly lit, honestly. I walked over to grab soap. This was around 2 in the morning, so I still had quite a bit more time. I was grabbing the soap when I heard echoed footsteps. I was the only one there. I walked out of the aisle to see what looked to be a mid-20s male. "Who are you?" I yelled at him, shivering. He said his name was Josh. This was the first night on the job. He was told to look for the other worker to get some assistance, and was told that the warehouse was where we got soap, and also where the break room was. I was creeped out, but he seemed legit. He knew the manager's name and answered all the questions that I asked him. We started working and everything was going well. He took an hour's break at 5, pretty much to get out of work early. Said he would see me tomorrow night. The clock hit 6, and soon after, my manager arrived. I asked why he didn't tell me about Josh. He looked confused. The night worker? What he told me made the hairs on my neck stand up. "There are no new night employees. You were working alone tonight. Was someone here with you?" A police report was filed, but to my knowledge, nothing has really come up. I quit the job the next day, and I never went back to that Walmart again. My only paranormal experience was wild. Okay, to start this, I want to say I'm now an adult 28-year-old male. This story happened when I was around 15 years old, and to date still blows my mind. So for context, when I was 15, I was a little pothead. I loved smoking weed, so whenever I got the chance, which was basically every day, I would get high with my friends. We'll come back to that later. I grew up in a town in the UK that was huge for a town. We had nearly 100,000 residents, so yeah, pretty big. Where I used to live was in like an estate full of houses. I had a best friend at the time who lived about a 20 to 25 minute walk from my house, but in order to get there, you had to walk through a wooded area that led to a big lake that you would walk around to get to near his house. So one day, randomly, I was out with my friend, who I just mentioned, plus many others, when we noticed a lot of police presence in the area near the woods. Plus, there was a police helicopter up in the air. Being curious, we followed the police to the woodlands that separated our houses. We went through the woods to the lake, where the police and ambulance workers were amongst many bystanders at this point. We got there and started asking people we knew about what happened. We were told that a young boy around the age of 7 had drowned in the lake near the path where everyone was gathering. Over the next couple of days, police were trawling the lake looking for the child, who they knew was there because his friend ran for help when he fell in and couldn't get out. 2 or 3 days after he slipped in, the authorities found the young boy's body, which was big news in my town. No later than 24 hours after the body was found, the local council installed a black metal bench on the footpath near where he died, with a little plaque commemorating his life. Okay, so that very next day I was out with my friend, over near where I lived. We were getting high with a bunch of other friends we knew. By the time we were done getting high, we decided to go back to his house to sleep, because my mom would have gone crazy over the fact that we were high. We started to walk back to his house at around 11 p.m. It was really dark out. We passed my house and eventually got to the woods. We walked through the woods and got to the start of the lake. We started walking down the side of the lake, down the path towards where the kid drowned in the bench was. We were just talking nonsense as high teens did, when I noticed that when the bench got into sight, that there was a man sat on the bench. Now, I was a bit freaked out by this, but I didn't say anything yet. It was 11 p.m. near the woods, in the dark. It was creepy. But when I got a little closer, I noticed I could see what the man was wearing, and he was dressed as a priest. You know, black jacket, white collar. Upon seeing this priest, I sighed some relief, because I just presumed he was praying or something of the sort for the kid that drowned in the spot about 4 days earlier. So after noticing this priest, I just watched him sit there as I got closer and closer. I didn't say anything to my friend who was right next to me, but we collectively stopped talking once we noticed the man. As we got closer, it was more obvious that he was a priest. And then once we got within about 5 meters, he was gone. Like, gone. I felt like I blinked and he just disappeared. When we were walking past the actual bench where I saw him sat, there was nobody there. But if he was to have gotten up and walked away, I'd have seen him. It's one-track walkway. After I got to the bench, I turned to my friend, who was just as confused and spooked as I was. I asked him if he had just seen that man sat on the bench. I didn't want to say what type of man, because the way he was dressed was very obvious as to what type of man he was. But as I asked him, "Did you just see that man sat on the bench?" He said, "Yeah, the guy dressed like a priest." When I tell you my heart sunk, I can't explain that feeling or that situation to this day. What gets me is I purposely asked my friend if he had seen the man, and he corrected me by saying the man was a priest. If it was a person, they'd have had to have got up and walked away from us in a straight line down the path, which we would have seen, or they would have had to have walked past us. But when we got close, poof, gone. Still to this day, it is my only paranormal experience, but blows my mind every time I think about it. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you get an excellent night's sleep. Please enjoy the extra rain at the end. Good night, everybody.